Okay, so we're back in CES land at the moment. Obviously, there was the Nvidia reveal of the Super Series GPUs, which we'll be reviewing in due course. But some of the stuff which we were kind of half briefed on or briefed on, which we couldn't talk about until the actual conference. Well, there's some actually really interesting stuff happening, and actually, we should probably kick it off, Alex, with this question from one of my favourite supporters, Doctor I
Uh-oh.
Crap and Shits. He basically says, "Can you explain G-Sync Pulsar?" Now, G-Sync Pulsar
Oh,
was announced at CES 2024, and it is potentially very exciting stuff, right? So, can you explain it?
sure. G-Sync Pulsar is the merging of two technologies that NVIDIA has had, and I think they came around the same time originally. When G-Sync came out, the monitors that supported G-Sync, to my knowledge, almost all of them also supported something called ultra low motion blur, also known as ULMB, which would strobe the backlight of the display to decrease persistence blur, as in the blur that your eyes get from seeing a sample and hold display, displaying an image and then holding onto it until the next frame's ready, and then starting to roll that one out. You have ULMB rolling out at the same time as G-Sync, but the limitation there is G-Sync is trying to make it so that the graphics card is controlling the refresh rate of the monitor. ULMB and its version 1, version 2 implementation requires the monitor's refresh rate to be fixed for it to even work, because the pulsing is regular, it's happening in beat with the monitor's refresh rate. This is a limiting thing because let's say you have a 240 hertz monitor, which is becoming more and more popular every day, or 144 hertz, let's say. To get the benefits of ULMB 1 or 2, you would have to maintain that frame rate with the refresh rate. And that is not very realistic for modern games. It's really only applicable to very old games usually. So you'd have to make this choice of, do I want to have less blur when objects are moving or when my, camera's panning? Or do I want to have the ability for frame rate drops to occur without getting V-Sync judder? It's the difference between G-Sync and ULMB. G-Sync Pulsar is supposed to combine these technologies by varying the timing of the pulse of the backlight in tune with what G-Sync's G-Sync's refresh rate adjustments are doing. I haven't seen it in person.
No.
That's the one thing. So like NVIDIA's talking about this. I haven't seen it in person at CES. I'm going to assume it works because they're saying it does. In the past, there's been what John's talked about. You can hijack an LG CX and C1 to do this, can't you, John?
Oh, so there was kind of a weird thing in the firmware previously where when you used Dolby Vision input, they did not disable so on OLEDs it's different. Let me explain that first.
Yeah,
what you're
cool.
talking about with ULMB is strobing, and that's specifically because LCDs use a backlight to basically display it's a pixel layer, it's the layer with a backlight, and the light is what allows you to see it in any conditions, right? And by flickering it on and off, it more closely simulates, say, like an impulse style display like a CRT, where the reason CRTs don't really have this sort of motion blurs due to the way that the image is drawn. Although in that case, it's more line by line, right? It's scan lines rather than like an entire image at one time, which is really cool. I'd like to emulate that one day if displays are fast enough. But OLED, of course, has self-lighting pixels, so it doesn't need that. You don't actually turn off the backlight. So to achieve a similar effect, you use what I've always talked about, black frame insertion, where you're essentially blanking the pixels out for X amount of time before showing a new image. And by doing that, you achieve the same thing and actually better than LCD, because OLED pixels are instant response, but you get persistence blur due to the way that your retina perceives these images when displayed in a sample and hold fashion, right? So black frame insertion solves that. Now on specific LG models, for whatever reason, I think it's because Dolby Vision was relatively new, you could still enable black frame insertion with Dolby Vision engaged, and it actually did work. So you could do VRR and BFI. The problem there is that it was clearly not intended, because if the frame rate dropped below, like, say 80 frames per second, maybe 90, something like that, it would flicker in a way that I would describe only as dangerous for some people, where it's like you can imagine like real hardcore heavy flickering where it's like it's hard to look at because it's too much, right? But if if you're between like say 90 and 120, then it actually worked really well, which was cool to see. But clearly it wasn't ready. It's not implemented in any of their current sets, and it was never really an intended feature. This, though, is an intended feature, and that's exactly what it's designed to solve, is to give you that sort of motion clarity in line with, say, a CRT, which is one of the key reasons why I've continued to harp upon them for so many years, because the motion clarity is so far beyond sample and hold displays. But because of the support for VRR within the Pulsar spec, it's actually kind of taken things further. So if the motion clarity really is as good as they're saying, and we're hoping, this could conceivably offer better performance than a CRT, because you can't realistically do VRR on a CRT. There's actually some hacky ways that you can do it on a CRT, which very strange, not really officially supported, but you can kind of force it to change the refresh rate in real time. It is just analog electronics after all. But yeah, this is extremely promising. And my only real question right now is, in all the documentation, everything they're talking about here, they're only referring to strobing and LCDs specifically. And I think we've asked them to clarify this to see if we haven't heard back yet, because I think they're all busy at CES. But presumably this would also work on OLED type displays. It would, rather than strobing the backlight, you're essentially inserting blanking periods between drawing the pixels. So hopefully it's supported there as well, because, I mean, all three of us were on OLEDs at this point. I think that's where we saw it a lot at CES as well. There's a lot of PC focused OLED displays in the works on the way. So I think it would behoove Nvidia to make sure that this is also feasible for OLED type displays. And the other thing I was curious about is strobing the backlight. They're talking about strobing the entire backlight, right? I'm curious if this would even be compatible with local dimming, because one of the solutions to LCD's terrible contrast ratio, if I'm honest, has been local dimming. And that means breaking up the backlight into many, many, many zones, right? That's where this whole, I think is it micro LED? I forget what one of them is referring to. A future. Is it mini LED? Because I think micro
is the current one.
Okay, mini might be the current one, and micro is the one we won't see for like 10 more years.
Gosh, I can't even remember. Yeah, like
it's whatever Sony's now using for their top end display, and we're starting to see it show up. I think it's in the iPad as well, as the iPad Pros now use this. But either way, it's many, many little LED elements that can all be individually switched on and off and varied, and that helps a lot with contrast, right? Because you can actually switch off parts of the screen. But the question is, will that work with Pulsar? Because then you're dealing with a much more complex backlight than just strobing the entire thing on and off. So there's still a lot of questions here that I have about how this is going to work. But conceptually, what they're offering here is a huge win for anybody that values motion clarity. And even if you think you don't value it yet, I can guarantee that at least with most people, if you show them the difference, show them what this provides, they'll be genuinely surprised and shocked at how much better things look. Right? It makes a huge difference.
It's also a meeting of like a halfway point of combining technologies, because like to otherwise get that CRT clarity John's talked about before, like the Blur Busters research about 1,000 hertz. Like getting actually 1,000 hertz, even with frame generation. Which generation of frame generation are we talking about here? Is the future?
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. We're not there yet on a lot of levels. No. So getting us to at least get there by strobing, as combined with VRR, to just, you just say like, okay, we can't get games to run that fast. Then this is a great way to do that. Probably also combined with frame gen at this point. And if we had something like 360 to 480 hertz displays, but they have like the performance of something even greater than it, like 1,000 hertz, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. I mean, other innovations at CES, there was the announcement that G-Sync is coming to GeForce Now, which, wow, that's a big deal, right?
Yeah, I mean, it does require a local, presuming they're going to be doing G-Sync only at the moment. I don't know if they're going to support adaptive sync, Like, do we know like if it actually does support, for example, like FreeSync or something like that? I don't know.
They're just talking about G-Sync. Well,
They're just talking about G-Sync.
Streaming to displays that support G-Sync, but there's different flavors of G-Sync.
Right.
Like so in TVs, for instance, they don't have a G-Sync module. And I think most displays these days that support G-Sync with the badge or whatever also do not use a specific module anymore.
Yeah.
So
it's gone above that now. Yeah. This is good because previously you could, like Rich has talked about it, like you can have that really low latency experience maybe by using GeForce Now, like ultimate tier is what they call it. Mm-hmm. But the fluidity of the image being provided to you is just, it looks like a V-synced image on your display, and maybe even worse actually.
It's worse.
It's probably worse. Than this, presuming it lines up really well and actually is forcing the refresh rate of the monitor to change. And I really am very curious about like what codec this is. How is it like overtaking like full screen and windowed modes on PCs? Like what is it exactly doing that it is allowed, can actually do this? Because not a lot of programs on your PC actually engage VRR behavior, even on the desktop.
So if you force it, it can be ruinous. Like trying to have
it can be detrimental.
VRR turned on while editing in Premiere, not a fun time.
Yeah, it's not good there. So it is interesting. I want to know how they did it. Once again, these are questions we sent off to Nvidia. We're hoping we get answers back. But I actually like this one a lot because it makes it like it's going to reduce the latency of what your eye is seeing on stream, because you're going to be getting it, and you're also going to be getting the benefits of reflex even more then, because reflex is always going to be running sub refresh rate anyways, sub native refresh rate, so like 117, 116, and usually 100 hertz display. So a lot of good stuff there. I actually
this is basically the only issue I have with GeForce Now at this point, is that you get 4080 tier class performance, so it is actually very, very fast. But when you're on a 4K 120 display like mine, the games will often run in, sort of 80 to 90 frames per second. So, you either lock down to 60, where you get a more consistent look, but you get more intrusive latency, or you run it in 120 hertz mode, but you get the judder. So in theory, you just run it in 120 hertz mode without the judder. If this all goes to plan, I guess, which would make this service even better. It was already excellent. So, this is kind of like the cherry on top almost.
It's the only streaming service I've ever used that actually looked pretty good to me.
Yeah.
Even though we could still tell the difference. I remember when Nvidia tried to trick us at Gamescom, and it was like an instant.
They weren't trying
No, it wasn't a
trick. They were seeing if we could tell the difference.
No, I know. It's not a trick. But it's the wrong word there. What I mean is, it was like basically trying to see how long it would take us to suss out which one was a direct feed and which one was actually being streamed. Yeah, and it took about a second. but still, even then, it's actually a pretty impressive service that does genuinely look good and better than any other streaming I've used. But the big problem with streaming has always been due to the nature of the internet, getting perfect frame times can be sometimes tricky. And it's not just frame rate drops. You also sometimes get interruptions to when the frame appears, causing subtle judder. V-Sync judder. It looks like V-Sync judder or frame pacing issues sometimes. So it's not like 100% smooth, but it feels like VRR support could actually kind of fix that, solve that.
Assuming there's like no, for example, like another thing that I've thought about is if there's input latency variations that they're receiving. So you're doing a pan with a mouse, and it should be smooth on your end in terms of the arc, but based upon when the samples are that are actually reaching NVIDIA HQ for that, it could actually, those could be packet missing, whatever, and they could be not actually linear at that point. And what they'd send back to you is technically correct, but it wouldn't be linear movement anymore. So there's, that's something that I don't know how you would lab that exactly. Maybe you'd send them like, I don't know, maybe you'd purposely disrupt your internet connection and see what the visual results looks like. That'd be something interesting to look at. But yeah, I think streaming still is a little bit more to go, even maybe beyond this. We'll see.